Inside one of the ruined homes near Augsburg, a woman named Liesel folded that very poster into kindling. Its red letters, faded but still defiant, read, "American food is trash." She watched it burn, orange light flickering across her face, and whispered to her children that tonight the fire would have to stand in for dinner. The war was over, but hunger had not surrendered. In 1946, victory and defeat looked the same. Hollow cheeks, thin coats, and empty bowls. Food had become a form of currency. A single egg could buy a pair of boots, a pound of butter, an entire week of labor. The Allied occupation divided the nation into zones, but scarcity united everyone. Even those who once marched proudly now shuffled through alleys, searching for potato peels behind American barracks. They'd been told the victors lived on rubber bread and canned sludge, yet somehow the victors never seemed to starve. Liesel's son, Otto, was 8. He spent his days searching the edges of the bomb train station for coal dust to sell. Once, he found a cracked tin labeled Spam. He had never seen such a word. The grayish meat inside smelled odd, too sweet, too oily, but he licked his finger anyway. His mother slapped his hand away in fear, not disgust. "It's American," she hissed. "They feed that to pigs." He said nothing, but later, when she wasn't looking, he finished every bit of it. In the countryside, farmers bartered cabbage for cigarettes, the new black market gold. Rumors drifted in like cold air. In the American sector, they said, people were being fed from military kitchens. Others claimed it was propaganda, another trick to win German hearts. "They make you eat their junk," one man muttered in a breadline. "Then they make you love it." The old hatred clung stubbornly, nourished by years of slogans. American food had been a caricature even before the war ended. German newspapers had mocked it as factory food for a factory people. They laughed at ketchup, at the bright orange cheese, at the idea of eating meat from a can. Even the soldiers at the front had shared stories. "The Americans fight on sugar," one officer had said bitterly, "and maybe that's why they never sleep." But now, with the Reich gone and bellies empty, pride was an expensive luxury. The first American trucks appeared in early spring, rumbling through villages where the sound of engines still meant fear. They carried sacks of flour, tins of butter, and crates stamped with an unfamiliar promise: U.S. Army humanitarian aid. People watched from their windows, suspicious but unable to look away. Children whispered that the boxes contained poison. One boy swore he saw the soldiers eating yellow bread that bent instead of broke. "It's fake," he said. "Made from powder." Still, hunger is a persuasive diplomat. Liesel, like many others, began to measure her pride against her children's ribs. She knew they couldn't last another month on turnip soup and dried nettles. One afternoon, she found herself following a small crowd toward the town square, where a sign, painted in clumsy German, hung from an army truck. "All welcome. Friendship meal." The words looked harmless, even kind, yet no one moved closer. The smell drifting from the truck was alien, warm, fat, salt, something sweet. The villagers stood in silence, caught between suspicion and craving. Captain Robert Hensley of the U.S. 3rd Infantry leaned against the tailgate, wiping grease from his hands. "They're scared to eat, Sarge," he said, half amused. His sergeant shrugged. "Wouldn't you be? We bombed 'em last year." They both laughed softly, though not unkindly. Behind them, a cook stirred a pot of buttered potatoes, the scent carrying across the cold air like a forbidden memory. For Liesel, that smell unlocked something she had forgotten. Sunday dinners before the war, her husband home from the rail yard, the sound of laughter instead of sirens. She stepped forward, dragging Otto and his little sister Marta behind her. "Nur für die Kinder," she whispered to the soldier at the truck. "Only for the children." The man smiled, handed her a plate and said, "For everyone, ma'am." The food was strange. The cornbread looked like cake but wasn't sweet, and the meat glistened under a syrupy glaze. She took a cautious bite. It was soft, rich, too heavy with salt, but it was food. Otto didn't hesitate. He devoured his portion, then licked his fingers, grinning through tears. For a moment, the bombed buildings around them seemed to blur into something else, a village that might one day be whole again. Word spread fast. Some mocked her afterward. So, the proud widow eats Yankee slop now? One neighbor sneered. But others listened when she said quietly, "It was good." The words felt strange on her tongue. She wasn't praising America, she was acknowledging survival. That night, she wrapped her children in the smell of warm bread clinging to their coats and prayed she wouldn't regret what she'd done. Across the river, a German baker named Herr Brandt watched the Americans unload more supplies. Once he'd refused to use their flour, calling it dust without soul. But his ovens were cold and his shelves empty. He walked over to a young private sorting sacks and asked, awkwardly, if he could trade something for a bag. The soldier, barely 20, said he could have it for free. Brandt didn't understand at first. "Free," he repeated. The boy shrugged. "It's just flour, sir." The baker carried it home in silence, feeling the weight of the word more than the bag. Days passed. More friendship meals appeared. Some Germans went out of curiosity, others out of desperation. Each time, the crowd grew. The American cooks were hardly chefs. They burned bacon, spilled beans, served everything too sweet, but the laughter in those makeshift dining lines was something new. It wasn't surrender. It was relief. Liesel returned a week later, this time without hesitation. She brought a small loaf of her own rye bread as thanks, handing it shyly to the cook. He tasted it, eyes widening. "This is real bread," he said. "Better than ours." She laughed softly for the first time in years. For a fleeting second, the line between victor and vanquished disappeared, replaced by something simpler, people eating, living. That night, as the last embers dimmed in her hearth, she thought of the old slogan now turned to ash, "American food is trash." The flames had devoured the words, but their meaning had changed long before the paper burned. Outside, more trucks rumbled through the village, their headlights slicing through the fog. No one yet knew that this experiment, the shared meal, the laughter between strangers, was only the beginning of something larger. Food, not fear, was about to redraw the lines of occupation. Liesel looked out the window, saw the glow of the American kitchen in the distance, and whispered to her children, "Tomorrow, we'll go again." And far away, inside the tent where the soldiers cleaned their pans, Captain Hensley wrote in his journal, almost as an afterthought, "We served them dinner tonight. They looked afraid, then grateful. Maybe food can win where war never could." He closed the notebook, unaware that history had just changed flavor. Steam curled from the army kitchen like a ghost that had forgotten the war. Metal ladles clanged, men shouted orders in English, and the air smelled of fat, warm, alien, tempting. The villagers gathered in the square again, this time less cautious, though pride still stiffened their shoulders. Word had spread about the friendship meal. Some said it was a trick to test loyalty. Others swore the food was blessed or cursed. Yet hunger, once it settled in the bones, had no nationality. Inside the tent, Private Jenkins stirred a pot of thick gravy with the diligence of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "They ain't coming," he muttered. "Whole town's just watching like we're feeding ghosts." His captain, Robert Hensley, leaned on a crate of rations marked U.S. Army or property of the American people. "They'll come," Hensley said quietly. "Pride always starves first." He wasn't sure if he believed that. He had fought through France and seen men kill for bread, but this was stranger. A war won by food instead of bullet. Outside, the same widow returned, Liesel, though the Americans didn't yet know her name. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her 2 children pressed against her skirt. The boys' eyes darted between the steaming pots and the wary faces around them. No one wanted to be first again. The memory of last week's meal lingered like a secret sin, sweet and shameful. Then, the unexpected happened. The local priest, Father Weber, stepped forward. Thin, tired, his black coat patched at the elbows, he walked straight to the soldiers and spoke in halting English. You feed the hungry? Hensley nodded. Yes, father. Everyone. The priest turned to the villagers and raised his voice. Then let us thank God, and not argue whose hands bring the bread. His words, heavy with exhaustion and faith, broke the silence that war had left behind. Slowly people approached. The soldiers worked quickly now, passing out tin plates loaded with cornbread, beans, buttered potatoes, and something that crackled with sweetness, fried apples dusted in sugar. To the Germans, the colors alone were shocking: yellow, gold, red. Food had been gray for so long that they had forgotten what warmth looked like. Liesel took a plate and stared at the contents as though deciphering a riddle. The cornbread crumbled in her hand, soft and fragrant. It smells strange, she whispered. Otto was already eating, cheeks full, his grin bright with melted butter. Marta, the little one, giggled as she tried peanut butter for the first time, her fingers sticking together. Around them, murmurs turned to laughter, cautious at first, then louder. For the first time since the war's end, the square echoed not with marching boots but with conversation. Inside the kitchen, Jenkins wiped his hands and peeked outside. Look at that, he said. Like a church picnic back home. Hensley didn't smile. It's not a picnic. It's penance. He stepped out to speak with the priest, offering him coffee. The old man accepted, inhaled the steam, and said softly, I told my parishioners for years that the devil came from across the sea. Seems he brought sugar instead. Hensley chuckled under his breath. Not the worst sin we've exported. The conflict, though quieter now, still lingered. Some villagers refused the food altogether, watching with folded arms. They feed us like dogs, one muttered. First they bombed us, now they fatten us. Another woman hissed back, then let them. Better to eat their mercy than our pride. It was not forgiveness, but survival wore many disguises. As the afternoon waned, Liesel noticed how the soldiers laughed among themselves, easy, unburdened. She envied it. Her world had become a museum of silence. The Americans were noisy, careless, alive. She wondered what it felt like to carry no guilt for the ruins around them. Hensley caught her gaze for a moment. Their eyes met, not as victor and vanquished, but as two people measuring loss. He offered her an extra slice of pie. She shook her head at first, then took it. The crust was soft, the filling too sweet, but it brought tears she hadn't expected. Later, when most of the plates were empty and the pots scraped clean, the villagers lingered near the tables. A soldier pulled out a harmonica, another began tapping a rhythm on an empty can. Children clapped along. The melody, some old American tune, sounded like sunlight through broken windows. Father Weber joined in, humming off-key. Someone passed him a spoonful of honey from an army tin, and he whispered, almost to himself, a miracle, in the language of sugar. But not everyone was ready to accept it. From across the square, the local butcher, Herr Reinhardt, approached Hensley. He had been a party member once, no longer proud of it, but not repentant either. Why do you do this? He asked bluntly. You think a meal makes us love you? The captain studied him for a moment. No, he said. But it might make you stop hating yourself. Reinhardt frowned, uncertain if it was an insult or wisdom. He walked away without replying, though that night, his wife would find him tasting peanut butter in secret. As evening fell, the Americans packed their gear. The villagers offered awkward goodbyes, half nods and stiff waves. The smell of bacon grease clung to the air long after the trucks left. Otto and Marta carried small scraps home in a handkerchief, nibbling them like treasure. Liesel followed behind, her steps slow, mind racing. Something had changed, not in the food, but in the silence between people. It was thinner now, easier to breathe through. In her kitchen, she placed the leftover cornbread on the table, still warm from her hand. 4 years she had fed her family bitterness dressed as loyalty. Now she wasn't sure what loyalty meant. Her husband had died in the war, her flag was gone, and the only thing that felt certain was that the Americans, for all their noise and excess, had given her children a reason to smile again. She tore off a piece and chewed thoughtfully. It tasted like nothing she'd ever made, clumsy, rich, too sweet, but she couldn't stop eating. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentler this time. She could hear laughter from the neighboring houses, the kind that starts small and grows when people remember they're still alive. Across the river, the army kitchen glowed faintly, a beacon in the night. Hensley stood outside, smoking, watching the same snow drift down on both sides of the river. Not bad for the worst food in the world, he murmured to himself. Jenkins grinned. Guess we're winning hearts through stomachs now, sir. Maybe, Hensley said, exhaling into the cold. Or maybe we're just feeding ghosts until they learn to live again. In the morning, the villagers would wake to find another notice nailed to the church door. Next meal, Saturday. Some would scoff, others would plan ahead. But one line beneath it, written in careful German by an unknown hand, would read, "We have tasted, and we have survived." Liesel saw it the next day and smiled faintly. For the first time since the surrender, those words didn't sound like surrender at all. They sounded like beginning. Morning light spilled through the broken rafters of the town hall, turning dust into glitter. The Americans had turned the space into a temporary dining hall, 2 long wooden tables, oil lamps, and a field stove that hissed like a living thing. The walls still bore scars from the war. Bullet holes, scorch marks, and a faint swastika outline that no one dared scrub yet. Over those ruins now hung something different, an improvised banner, painted in awkward German. "Friends eat together." The words looked uncertain, as though testing whether they belonged here. Captain Hensley stood near the stove, sleeves rolled up, cracking eggs into a metal bowl. He was no cook, but the army manuals didn't cover peace. Private Jenkins carried crates of apples, polishing each one on his sleeve before handing them to the German women who'd volunteered to help slice and stew them. Among them was Liesel, her hair tied back with a frayed ribbon. She worked quietly, knife flashing through fruit, her movements quick, deliberate, efficient. It was the first time Americans and Germans had cooked side by side. No one spoke at first. They just listened, to the scrape of knives, the bubbling of butter, the sound of food becoming something more than survival. For weeks now, these shared meals had grown from curiosity to ritual. At first, people came only to eat. Now they stayed to help, to laugh, to trade recipes. A few even brought ingredients. One woman bartered eggs for sugar. A farmer offered flour milled in secret. The Americans called it cooperation. The Germans called it Tuesday. Yet beneath the easy chatter, mistrust still simmered. Every joke, every smile, carried the faint question, could kindness last, or was it rationed too? Liesel caught Hensley watching her as she worked. He wasn't staring, not exactly, more like studying. Her calmness fascinated him. She'd lost her husband, her home, maybe even her faith, yet she moved with the quiet assurance of someone rebuilding an invisible world. When she looked up, their eyes met. He nodded. She nodded back. Nothing more. But in a room still echoing with old hatred, that simple exchange felt revolutionary. Jenkins, oblivious to the delicate balance, broke the silence with a grin. "Back home, my ma made apple butter like this every fall," he said, stirring the pot. "Whole house smelled like heaven." Liesel frowned, uncertain if apple butter was a joke. He handed her a spoon. "Taste." She hesitated, then did. Her eyes widened slightly. The flavor was sweet, warm, unfamiliar, like memory in reverse. "Too much sugar," she said. "Not enough salt." Jenkins laughed. "Lady, you sound just like her." The others chuckled. It was the first time laughter and German accents had shared the same space without malice. By noon, the hall smelled like paradise. Stewed apples, melted butter, roasted potatoes, the perfume of plenty. Children ran in and out, chased by soldiers pretending to guard the kitchen. Someone began to hum an old folk tune, and within minutes, voices joined from both sides. Even Father Weber arrived, bearing a basket of bread baked in the church oven. "Peace has a flavor," he said with a smile, "and it's buttery." For Hensley, Each meal was more than an act of goodwill. It was a quiet campaign, a war fought with spoons instead of rifles. He'd seen what hate could do when fed lies. Now he wanted to see what forgiveness tasted like. But not everyone approved. His superior officer in Munich had sent a memo warning him to maintain professional distance. Aid yes. Friendship no. Hearts and minds aren't part of your job, Captain, the memo read. Hensley ignored it. He'd lost enough soldiers to understand that orders were easier to give than to live with. That afternoon, as snow began to fall again, Liesel's son Otto appeared at the kitchen door. "Mama," he said, "the Americans gave me chocolate." His mouth was already ringed with brown. She smiled faintly. "Then thank them properly." He ran to Hensley, saluted clumsily, and said, "Thank you, Captain." The captain laughed, ruffled his hair, and offered another piece. It was such a small act, yet in a world where kindness had been rationed for years, it felt extravagant. Later, when the meal began, the hall filled with warmth and sound. Germans and Americans sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing bread, passing dishes, comparing words. Jenkins tried to explain peanut butter again, pantomiming how to spread it. A farmer's wife took a bite and grimaced. "It is glue," she said. The table erupted with laughter. "Exactly," Jenkins replied. "Sweet glue." The awkwardness dissolved in humor. For the first time, the meal didn't feel like charity. It felt like community. In the corner, an elderly man with trembling hands lifted his cup. "To peace," he said softly. His voice cracked on the word. "To never starving again." The Americans joined the toast. "To peace," Hensley echoed, though privately he wondered how long it would last. Outside, the snow thickened, blurring the landscape into white oblivion. The war had ended on paper, but not in memory. Forgiveness, he thought, was a dish that took time to cook. Afterward, as the crowd thinned, Liesel stayed behind to clean. The others left her scraps to pack for her children, bits of pie crust, leftover potatoes, half an apple. Hensley lingered, lighting a cigarette. "You've got a good hand in the kitchen," he said. She shrugged. "I had to learn. Hunger teaches fast." He nodded, then asked quietly, "Do they still hate us?" She paused, wringing a cloth in the basin. "Maybe not today." He smiled at that. "That's a start." The moment hung between them, strange, fragile, real. The kind of silence where truth feels close enough to touch. Then Marta, half asleep on a bench, murmured something in German. "The apple smells like home." Liesel's eyes softened. "She remembers before the bombs," she said. When apples meant autumn, not survival. Hensley looked down at his boots, embarrassed by the tenderness in the room. "Maybe we're bringing autumn back," he said. She almost laughed. "Americans and their big promises." "Only the edible ones," he replied. By evening, the hall was empty. Outside, children built snowmen wearing army cap. The soldiers waved as they drove back to camp, headlights cutting through the fog. From her window, Liesel watched them disappear, her apron still dusted with flour. For the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel alone. The world wasn't healed, but it had exhaled. Far away, in the officers' quarters, Hensley opened a letter from home. His sister had sent a recipe for apple pie, scribbled in cursive, with a note. "Make something sweet where you are, Robbie. The world needs it." He smiled, folded it into his pocket, and decided that next week's meal would include pie. Not rations, not army food, real pie. In the following days, rumors spread through nearby towns. Americans cooking with Germans? Eating together? Impossible. Yet word traveled faster than disbelief. By the time the next Saturday came, twice as many villagers arrived at the hall, some carrying baskets of their own, milk, eggs, flour. They came not as beggars but as neighbors. When Liesel stepped inside, she saw something that made her heart stop. On the stove, cooling under a towel, was an apple pie. The smell filled the room. Cinnamon, butter, peas. She looked at Hensley. He just nodded toward the table. She sat, cut a slice, and took a slow bite. Around her, laughter rose again, blending languages until they no longer mattered. For a fleeting instant it was easy to believe the war had never happened. Then the door opened, letting in a gust of cold air, and with it, a stranger in an officer's coat, carrying a folder stamped with the seal of the military government. His eyes swept the room, disapproving. Hensley straightened. The laughter faded. Peace, it seemed, had an expiration date. The officer's boots echoed through the hall, each step tightening the air that had moments before smelled of pie and laughter. Captain Hensley recognized him instantly. Major Charles Whitmore, a man who wore his uniform like a sermon. "Captain," Whitmore said, his tone clipped, "I trust you can explain why a U.S. Army installation has turned into a village bakery." Around them, the Germans froze mid-motion, unsure whether to stand, flee, or fade into the walls. The apple pie on the table steamed between them, innocent and incriminating. Hensley straightened. "We were instructed to provide humanitarian aid, sir," he said evenly. "We're feeding them." Whitmore's gaze swept over the crowded tables. German women, children, American soldiers laughing softly. "Feeding them is one thing. Eating with them is another. You're blurring lines, Captain." He picked up a fork, inspected it, and set it down. "Compassion is commendable. Fraternization is not." His words fell like cold ash. Before Hensley could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Major," said Father Weber from his seat near the door, "forgive me, but the only lines blurred here are the ones between hunger and hope." The old priest's voice trembled, yet it held a quiet authority that even war had not broken. If these men had served the same bread in 1939, perhaps we would not be meeting under occupation. Whitmore stared at him, startled by the defiance, then exhaled. "Be careful, Father. Hope can be a dangerous meal." The major left soon after, leaving behind a silence that clung to the rafters. Hensley looked around the room, the villagers watching him, uncertain, afraid the kindness might end. "We'll be back next week," he said finally. Liesel met his eyes, then nodded. No applause followed, only the sound of knives scraping plates, a fragile rhythm of defiance. Outside, snow melted into mud. Spring was coming, though no one dared call it that yet. In Munich, orders tightened. No fraternization, no shared meals. Yet across Bavaria, stories of the friendship kitchens had already spread. Journalists called them miracles of mercy. Others called them American propaganda disguised as pudding. To the people who ate there, it was simply breakfast. Weeks passed. The occupation shifted from rebuilding to reorganizing. Soldiers rotated home, replaced by administrators with clipboards. One morning, Hensley's unit received orders to close the kitchen. Jenkins slammed a pot down so hard the handle broke. "We're shutting down hope, sir," he muttered. "That's what we're doing." Hensley didn't answer. He read the order twice, then folded it and tucked it into his pocket. The words felt heavier than the medals on his chest. When he arrived at the hall to deliver the news, he found Liesel already there, preparing dough with her sleeves rolled up. She glanced at him once and saw everything in his face. "They're ending it, aren't they?" she asked. He nodded. "Officially, yes." Her hands paused. "And unofficially?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Unofficially, the ovens don't report to Washington." That evening, under the dim lantern light, they cooked one last time together. Germans and Americans, priests and farmers, widows and soldiers. The room glowed with the same fragile peace they'd built from flour and trust. Children passed plates, laughter filled the corners, and the scent of apple pie rose once more, daring the darkness to notice. When the last slice was served, Hensley stood and spoke quietly. "This isn't the end. Someday soon, you won't need us to bring food. You'll make your own again." Liesel looked around at the people she'd once thought her enemies. "We already have," she said. That night, after the hall emptied, she packed a small basket, bread, a slice of pie, and a folded note, and walked to the American camp. Hensley was sitting alone outside his tent, the glow of his cigarette dim against the vast black sky. She handed him the basket without a word. "For the road," she said. He lifted the napkin and saw her handwriting on the note. "You taught us to eat without fear." He looked up, but she was already walking away, her footsteps vanishing into the snow. 2 weeks later, the Americans left Augsburg. The trucks rolled out before dawn, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Villagers stood silently along the road, some waving, others simply watching. When Hensley's truck passed Liesel's house, he saw her standing by the gate with her children. Otto waved a small flag, American, hand-drawn, crooked but proud. Hensley saluted through the window, then vanished into the white morning. Years passed. The war's ruins turned to scaffolds, then to skylines. In 1948, the Marshall Plan began, a tidal wave of grain, milk powder, and hope pouring into Western Europe. American wheat filled German bakeries, powdered eggs became cakes, canned fruit became dessert again. Newspapers called it the reconstruction of the stomach. Coca-Cola appeared in corner shop. Children traded chocolate for marbles. The taste of survival was slowly replaced by the taste of plenty. Liesel, now working at a small bakery in Augsburg, saw it firsthand. American food, once scorned as machine-made, had become the flavor of the future. Teenagers asked for pancakes with syrup and coffee with cream. Housewives learned recipes from pamphlets distributed by aid workers. American pie, victory cake, pancake MIT syrup. The irony wasn't lost on her. She often thought of that first cornbread, the one she'd eaten in fear and shame. Now, the same recipe hung framed in her bakery, scrawled in English and German side by side. One evening, she closed the shop early and took a walk to the old town hall. The banner was long gone, the walls repainted, but she could still smell butter in the wood when the sun hit it just right. A letter waited in her pocket, creased, faded, forwarded from an address in Kansas. It had taken years to reach her. The handwriting was careful, military. "Dear Mrs. Liesel," it began. "We met once in a ruined hall when peace was still fragile. I still remember the way your daughter said the apple smelled like home. I wanted you to know that back here, our harvests are good again. I keep your note in my desk. Sometimes when the world feels cruel, I read it and remember that kindness can rebuild what bombs destroy." She read it twice, then folded it against her heart. The sky over Augsburg glowed pink with dusk. Somewhere nearby, the smell of baking drifted through the air, flour, sugar, butter, the eternal language of healing. In 1950, the bakery won a small award from the city council for contributing to community renewal. The mayor, a former soldier, presented the medal personally. "Your pies remind people of peace," he told her. She smiled, modest, then said, "They remind people that peace must be fed." Decades later, when Otto took over the bakery, he kept that same framed recipe on the wall. Tourists often asked about it. "American," he'd say proudly. "It saved us." He never told them about the war or the hunger or the priest who challenged an officer. He didn't need to. Every slice of apple pie told the story better than words could. And yet, in one quiet corner of the shop, an old photograph hung by the window. Soldiers and civilians around a long wooden table, steam rising, laughter caught mid-breath. Beneath it, a handwritten caption in both languages read, "Friends eat together." One day, decades later, a letter arrived from the United States. Otto opened it, eyes widening as he read. It was from a man named Robert Hensley, retired colonel, 83 years old. Inside was a photo of his family at their own kitchen table, smiling beside an apple pie. The note was simple, still cooking the taste of peace. Otto placed the letter in the window beside the old photograph. That evening, as twilight pooled over the cobblestones, he turned the sign on the door to closed, sliced himself a piece of pie, and raised it quietly to the fading light. Outside, church bells rang for supper, just as they had in 1946, and for a moment the world felt full again.